It happened so fast, I almost believed I'd imagined it. The music hadn't even started yet. Guests were still milling around sipping champagne, waiting for the bride to emerge. I was standing near the back of the hall behind the last row of chairs, holding my small silver clutch with both hands like it might anchor me to the floor. I had asked the young usher, a boy in a pressed tux who couldn't have been more than 20, if he could help me find my seat. I didn't expect what came next. Before the usher could answer, I saw her Emily, my daughter-in-law, walking toward me, the hem of her dress brushing the aisle runner like a whisper turning into thunder. Her face was expressionless. Not angry, not kind. Blank. She stopped just a few feet in front of me, white fabric glowing under the string lights, guests slowly starting to quiet, sensing something wrong. She looked me straight in the eye. "You don't belong here," she said loud enough for others to hear. I don't know what expression fell across my face. I only remember the usher stepping back awkwardly, looking down at his shoes, and a murmur moving through the nearest row. I glanced to my right, hoping to catch my son's face, maybe see confusion or concern, but Jason was standing near the altar, eyes fixed firmly ahead, jaw tight, unmoved. I swallowed whatever breath was still in my lungs. Emily didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She turned slow and elegant, like the moment hadn't happened, and walked back up the aisle. And I just stood there. I stood there while the guests began looking away, while someone restarted the music, while the ceremony rolled on like a machine that no longer had a place for me. I don't remember how I left. I remember the sound of my shoes on the marble floor, the way the air outside hit my face like winter even though it was early June. I remember the faint sting in my left hand where my rings used to sit before I took them off years ago. I remember walking past the valet without a word and driving myself home in my old beige sedan, wondering if I'd dreamed it. But I hadn't. I wasn't just excluded from the front row. I wasn't late or uninvited or mistakenly omitted. I was erased. And that kind of erasure doesn't happen by accident. I didn't cry. Not at first. Not in the car. Not when I took up my heels and placed them beside the closet. Not when I unzipped the plum-colored dress I'd saved for the occasion and laid it gently across the bed tag still attached. I didn't cry as I poured myself a glass of wine, or when I sat down in the quiet of my small dining room and listened to the echo of forks. I could almost hear laughter, clinking glasses, a life continuing without me. The tears didn't come until later. Hours later, long after the wedding had ended, long after the toasts and the dancing and the cake, long after I imagined Jason carrying Emily into their honeymoon suite, his hands so gentle on her waist. They came in the bathroom of all places. I was brushing my teeth. And in the mirror, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Her eyes were puffier than they used to be, the corners drawn down not just by time, but by disappointment. Her mouth looked tired. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. Her lipstick was smudged. And behind her, reflected in that cold mirror, was a single envelope, the wedding invitation still pinned to the fridge by a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. That's when it broke open. A sound came out of me I didn't know I could make, something raw somewhere between a sob and a cough. I held the edge of the sink like I might collapse. I sank to the tile floor back against the cabinet and I cried with my whole body, quietly, violently, like something was being torn out of me. Not grief, not even anger. Something older. Something I hadn't let myself feel for years. I had believed foolishly that if I just stayed kind, if I stayed helpful and patient and non-intrusive, if I made myself small and available, I would be included. I would be loved. But love doesn't work that way. At least not theirs. The next morning, there were no messages on my phone, no apology, no excuse. Not from Jason, not from Emily, nothing from the extended family either. Not even a stray voicemail from a confused cousin wondering why I left early. It was as if I had been edited out of the day, cropped from the picture before the shutter even clicked. I spent the afternoon pruning my garden. I clipped back the rose bush near the fence line, trimmed the creeping ivy that had started to overtake the side of the shed. I kept my hands busy, my mouth shut. There's something almost holy about tending to things that grow regardless of whether you're thanked for it. I kept remembering Emily's face. Not her words, not the volume, but her expression. There was no rage in it, no glee. Just a flat, vacant dismissal, like I was a stain on her otherwise perfect day. And somewhere in that expression, I began to understand this hadn't been spontaneous. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment reaction. This was designed. That day at the wedding, that was the final act. The erasure had been happening for years. I just hadn't noticed until I was already gone. I spent the rest of the week in a kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the seconds were coated in wax, each one slow and quiet and suffocating. I kept expecting something, a call, a knock on the door, an awkward apology text from Jason with too many ellipses and not enough truth. But there was nothing. By the end of the week, I finally stopped checking my phone every few minutes. Not because I no longer cared, but because I knew. I knew in that way a mother knows when her child has already made up his mind. It wasn't a mistake. I wasn't overlooked. I was uninvited from my own life. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want pity. I didn't want advice. I didn't want to hear my sister's voice over the phone saying I never liked her anyway, like that would undo the fact that my son stood and watched as his bride told me I didn't belong. Instead, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small stack of photos. Jason's third-grade class picture, his first baseball trophy, the birthday card he made me when he was 11 with stick figures holding hands, and Mommy, I'll never leave you written in blue crayon. I ran my thumb across the paper and wondered, where did he go? The boy who used to crawl into my bed when it stormed. The teenager who would text me from the bus just to say, "Hey, love you." The young man who cried when I surprised him with his acceptance letter to NYU, who stood in the doorway of our tiny apartment and whispered, "You gave up everything for me." That version of Jason had died long before the wedding. I just hadn't held the funeral yet. That night I pulled out the photo album Emily had given me 2 Christmases ago. It was leather-bound, stamped with gold letters, "Our Growing Family." She'd included wedding pictures of her parents' vacations with her siblings, even an ultrasound photo of her cousin's baby, but not a single one of me. At the time, I told myself it was just an oversight, that she hadn't found the right pictures yet, that she'd add me in later. But now I understood. That album wasn't meant to include me. It was a replacement, a rewritten history. A book with the ending already written where I wasn't in the cast. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took out my old journals. I'd kept them hidden in the back of the linen closet inside a shoebox marked winter scarves. Most were filled during the years Jason was in college and medical school. Letters I never sent. Anger I never voiced. Pages of questions about whether I was doing too much or not enough. Lines like, "I think Emily hates me. I don't know why. I haven't done anything. He didn't call on my birthday. I told myself he was busy, but he always used to find a way. I think I'm being erased. The proof had been there. I just hadn't wanted to believe it. That afternoon, I took a drive. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to move to see the world existing outside the narrow frame of my loneliness. I ended up an hour north in a small coastal town I hadn't visited since Jason was in high school. There was a bookstore with chipped paint and a diner that still served coffee in thick cream-colored mugs. I walked in and ordered the same thing I used to chicken salad sandwich, extra pickles. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a warm smile, said, "You visiting someone?" I said no, just remembering who I used to be. She didn't ask what I meant. She just refilled my coffee and gave me a quiet kind of kindness that felt like a balm on an old wound. I sat there for hours, and for the first time I let myself ask the real question: when did my love become disposable? It wasn't just Emily. She was a symptom. Polished, poised, all surface, and no substance. But Jason was the one I raised. I'd taught him to care, to protect, to tell the truth. And yet, he stood there. He watched me be humiliated. He let it happen. That betrayal lived somewhere deeper than words could reach, deeper than rage. It was cellular. It was like a part of my body had betrayed me. When I got home that night, I turned off all the lights except the one in the hallway. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. My purse still hung from my shoulder. My shoes were still on. But inside, something had shifted. There would be no confrontation. Not yet. Because confronting them would mean they had the power to grant or deny me something. And I was beginning to understand the only thing I had left to claim was myself. The next few weeks passed like fog. Days blurred together, mornings folding into afternoons, with no sound but the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional rattle of wind against the windows. I'd always found comfort in solitude, but this wasn't that. This was something different. This was erasure by silence. There were no calls, no texts, no cards or flowers or belated explanations. Nothing from Jason. Not a single word. The only sign that the wedding had even happened, apart from the acid burn of memory, was a photo posted on Emily's Facebook page. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't even listed. But I saw it. A wide shot of the altar, her white dress flaring like a bell, Jason standing beside her in his blue suit, his hand on her back. And beside them in the front row sat her family, her mother, her sisters, her aunt from Arizona, all smiling. My seat was never empty. It was filled by someone else. That detail lodged in me like a shard of glass. Not just absence replacement. Someone had taken my place. Someone had sat where I was supposed to sit, smiled where I was supposed to smile. And Jason had let it happen. One evening, I found myself standing in front of my mirror again, brushing my hair in slow, deliberate strokes. 45 strokes on each side, a habit I picked up as a girl. I used to do this when I was nervous or lost. As I brushed, I said the words out loud for the first time. I wasn't wanted. My own voice startled me. I wasn't even tolerated. It should have sounded pitiful, but it didn't. It sounded like the truth, like opening a sealed door in my chest and finally letting the air move again. That night, I made myself a small dinner, grilled chicken, asparagus, and a scoop of mashed potatoes, and sat on the couch with the TV muted. I didn't want sound. I wanted stillness. I needed to feel how alone I really was. No illusions, no hope perched on the windowsill. The plate went cold before I could finish it, and that was when I really started to see it the slow, quiet ways they'd been pushing me out for years. It wasn't just the seating chart or the Facebook photo. It was the holidays that had gradually shifted from "we'd love to see you" to "we're doing something smaller this year." It was the time Jason asked me to take a step back so Emily could have more space to build her own traditions. The birthday cards that came late unsigned. The way Emily would smile at me with her mouth but not her eyes. It was the Mother's Day brunch they forgot. The more I let the silence sink in, the more I saw how much noise I'd been making all these years to pretend I was still part of their life, the invitations I extended, the gifts. I gave the meals I cooked the way I said, of course every time they needed help, even when I was exhausted. I had built a bridge they never bothered to cross. So I stopped calling. I didn't tell anyone. Not friends, not my sister, not my old co-worker Dolores who called once a month to check in. I simply stopped. No holiday card, no follow-up text. I didn't send the thank you note I'd written for the wedding invite. I didn't even finish it, and they didn't notice. Weeks passed, then a month. Still nothing. Then one morning I opened my email to find a message from my bank. A routine alert about a minor overdraft on an account I hadn't used in over a year. It didn't make sense. I kept most of my funds in my savings and had only left a small cushion in that checking account. I clicked through thinking it was a glitch. But what I saw made my mouth go dry. 2 transactions had been processed within minutes of each other, one to a bridal boutique, the other to a photography service. Both charges were tied to an automatic debit card I hadn't used since before Jason's engagement. I blinked. Then I scrolled. And there it was, a note beside the account dated 10 months ago. Card holder access updated per power of attorney. Power of attorney. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had never signed that, not for this account, not for any account since my surgery 3 years ago. And even then, it had been temporary. Emergency only. Jason had promised. I logged into my records, pulled up a copy of the POA agreement he'd filed. It was supposed to have expired after I recovered. I'd been well for over 2 years now. Why was it still active? And how was it possible he or someone had used it to make wedding purchases? From my account. A slow panic rose in my chest. Not wild, not screaming, cold. Controlled. I opened my desk drawer where I kept all my financial records. I pulled out folders, tax returns, bank statements. I cross-referenced every charge. There were others, not just wedding expenses, payments to a storage facility I didn't recognize, a donation to a personal growth retreat made 6 months ago under my name. And buried at the bottom of the folder, printed on pale yellow paper, was a document I didn't remember signing. A permanent POA designation notarized, dated with my name misspelled by 1 letter. My breath caught. It was forged. And it wasn't just about money. It was about control. About eliminating me, not just from the wedding, but from the structure of their lives. Financially, legally, familially. I wasn't just a guest unwelcome at the table. I was a risk. An obstacle. A liability to be quietly managed, shut out, and drained dry without notice. And they had already begun. I sat in that chair for a long time, hands resting on the edge of the desk, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The room felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in. But my mind was suddenly clear. They hadn't just uninvited me from the wedding. They were erasing me from the future. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers, still in my clothes, the overhead light off, but the bedside lamp glowing weakly. I stared at the ceiling arms folded across my chest, thoughts screaming in a voice I couldn't silence. It wasn't just betrayal. It was planning. It was structure. Jason had known exactly what he was doing. I could picture them sitting at their kitchen island, Emily scrolling on her laptop, Jason sipping coffee from the blue ceramic mug I gave him when he graduated, going over options. That's the word I imagine they used. Not theft, not deception. Options. And the worst part? They probably convinced themselves they were justified. That I was fragile or overbearing or incapable. That pushing me out was a kindness. I sat there in the dark until the birds began to sing. The next morning I made a list. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I listed every document, every transaction, every account I needed to review. Then I pulled my folding step stool out of the pantry and climbed up to the top shelf of the hall closet where I kept my old tax returns and legal records. That's when I found it. A manila envelope labeled in Jason's handwriting for safekeeping. Inside, my original living will edited, a notarized signature page that looked wrong, a copy of my old deed transfer agreement from when I sold part of my land to help fund Jason's down payment years ago. I hadn't looked at that deed in years, but now that I did, I saw something strange. My name had been removed not just from the title, but from the warranty clause. I sat down hard on the floor envelope spilling beside me. Somewhere between the lines, a picture was forming. Not just neglect. Not just coldness. Extraction. They had been siphoning not just affection, but resources. Quietly. Methodically. With clean lines and forged patience. I checked the timestamp on the scanned copy of the updated will. It had been submitted by email from Emily's address, the day after my minor surgery 2 years ago. I remembered now. I'd been groggy, lying on my sofa with a heating pad and a mug of ginger tea. Jason had stopped by to help sort some mail. He said he was going to take some things to the safe deposit box. He left with a smile, said he'd pick up soup for dinner. He never came back that night. I remember thinking, that's strange. But I didn't say anything, didn't want to seem ungrateful. Now I understood why. The signature on that updated will wasn't mine. It looked like mine, almost. But the tail on the T in Thompson was too high. I've written my name the same way since I was 17. That wasn't my hand. They had been building a paper trail that led to my disappearance, and it almost worked. I sat on the floor of my hallway for hours. The light through the window changed from soft gold to stark white. Dust danced in the air. By noon, I stood up, brushed off my skirt, and pulled down a second envelope, the one with my mother's name on it. She had died 7 years ago, but I had never closed her case file. She had left behind a trail of bank statements and notes, all handwritten meticulous. I thought maybe she could show me something. Maybe that neat old-fashioned handwriting, those careful lines, could lend me the strength I needed. That afternoon, I went to the courthouse. I didn't call ahead. I didn't dress for battle. I wore my soft gray cardigan and navy slacks, the ones I used to wear on Sundays. I carried the documents in a simple file folder, no labels, no tabs. I walked in like a woman who had nothing left to lose. I asked to speak with the records clerk, then the estate officer, then finally a notary I'd known years ago when I worked on a hospital committee downtown. Her name was Diane. She recognized me immediately. Eleanor. It's been ages. She looked older, too. Same kind eyes, but deeper lines. I placed the signed document on the counter between us. "Do you remember this?" She squinted at the paper, then blinked hard. "I never signed this. That's not my stamp." I nodded. She looked at me, lips parting slightly. "Is someone using your name?" "Worse," I said softly. "They're using my absence." By the end of the day, I'd started a formal inquiry into the forged documents. Quietly. No announcement. No confrontation. Just truth laid bare in ink and protocol. That night, I sat on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The air was cool. My garden was quiet. A few late tomatoes hung stubbornly to the vines. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel rage. I felt distance. The kind of distance that grows like a gulf between islands after years of quiet erosion. Jason hadn't called in over a month. I wondered if he'd ever call again. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. The wedding was a month behind me when the first envelope arrived. No return address, just my name written in neat, unfamiliar script. It was sealed with a cheap gold sticker, the kind you find in bulk packs at office supply stores. I held it for a long time before opening it, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Inside was a folded card. Embossed. Heavy. Thick, expensive cardstock with a watercolor of white lilies on the front. A thank you card. "Thank you for the generous support toward our special day. Your gift helped make our wedding unforgettable. With love, Emily and Jason." No mention of the account it had been taken from. No acknowledgement of what I'd endured. No apology. Just a vague, sterile expression of gratitude, the kind you send to a stranger who sent a check. I laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, not really. It was short, breathless, almost surprised. The absurdity of it. The finality. They weren't just cutting me out. They were replacing me with a performance. A story. A version of events where I had given them the money, where I had blessed the day. And here it was in black ink, preserved like a lie in amber. The next morning I woke up early. I showered, blow-dried my hair, put on my black slacks, and the forest green blouse I usually saved for holidays. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched the light shift on the floor. At 10 o'clock, I picked up the phone and called my attorney. His name was Carl Brenner. I hadn't spoken to him in over 4 years, not since updating my will after my health scare. He answered with the same gravelly voice and dry efficiency I remembered. "Eleanor Thompson," he said. To what do I owe the pleasure? I told him everything. Not in a rush, not in hysteria. I laid it out, the forged documents, the false POA, the accounts accessed without consent, the altered deed, the notary's statement. He didn't interrupt. He didn't reassure. He just listened. And when I was done, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "We need to make this official." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Are you ready to make it formal?" "I am," I said. "But I don't want to fight." "What do you want?" I looked at the flowers on my windowsill. Chrysanthemums, pink and white, just beginning to brown at the edges. "I want my name back." He didn't ask what I meant. He understood. Within 3 days, the paperwork was in motion. We filed a motion to revoke the fraudulent POA and initiated a quiet inquiry into property mismanagement and financial abuse. I didn't want headlines. I didn't want police knocking on their door. I wanted something else. I wanted a reckoning that spoke in documents, in silence, in slow unraveling. Let them explain it to the bank. Let them wonder who had tipped the ledger sideways. Let them feel the weight of the choices they made, not with a courtroom scene, but with the steady drip of consequence. But that was only part of it. I needed one final thing. A moment. Not revenge. Not spectacle. Reclamation. So I planned it. Jason's wedding reception had been held at a winery just outside the city. A pretty place draped in ivy and rented candles. They had held a family brunch there the following weekend, a send-off before the honeymoon. I hadn't been invited, but I knew they would be there again. Emily's cousin was hosting a baby shower in the same venue, and I'd seen the public invitation while browsing social media. She'd posted pictures of the preparations, even mentioned the date. The place had no gate, no security, just a gravel path lined with lavender. I didn't go to disrupt anything. I didn't go to scream. I went to sit. I parked across the street, walked the path, and stood beside the back hedge, a spot overlooking the lawn where folding chairs were set in perfect rows just like the wedding. No one noticed me. I wasn't dressed like a guest. I wore soft gray slacks, a cream sweater, and my old wool coat. Something in me wanted to look like a ghost. I waited until the chatter picked up, the photo-taking started. The champagne began to pour. Then I stepped forward. One chair sat slightly off-center at the edge of the group. Maybe it was meant for the photographer. Maybe someone hadn't shown. I walked to it. I pulled it gently away from the circle, angled it toward the lavender, and sat. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at anyone. I didn't need to. Emily saw me first. Her voice didn't rise this time. She froze, one hand holding a flute of champagne, the other dangling at her side like a string cut loose. Her lips parted slightly, her brow pulled together. Jason turned when she did. His eyes met mine. He didn't speak either. I gave them the smallest nod. Not approval, not forgiveness. Recognition. This was what you tried to erase, and I'm still here. I sat for 5 full minutes. Then I stood, smoothed my coat, walked back to my car. That was the confrontation. No shouting, no tears, just a woman in a chair that no one thought she'd claim a chair. They thought she'd forgotten. But I hadn't. And that day, I made sure they wouldn't forget either. I didn't cry when I got back in the car. Not on the long, winding road back into town. Not when I passed the grocery store where Jason and I used to pick out Halloween pumpkins. Not when I pulled into the driveway of the little white house I once thought I'd grow old in, surrounded by grandchildren. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the porcelain warm my palms, and I just sat. Something in me had gone quiet. Not dead, not numb, just finally still. That chair had been mine long before they took it away, and now, after everything, I'd taken it back not by force, but by being there, by sitting, by showing that I hadn't vanished, and that I never would. That night I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one where I'd stored things I couldn't quite throw away, but couldn't bear to look at either. Old Christmas cards from Jason, faded construction paper drawings from his preschool days, a dried corsage from his high school graduation. I let myself touch them, let myself remember. There was grief, yes, but there was no shame anymore. Because I knew the truth now, I hadn't failed as a mother. I had loved as a mother. And what they had done with that love, how they had twisted it, buried it, pretended it was a burden that wasn't my weight to carry anymore. The next day I made an appointment. Not with a therapist, not with a lawyer, with a realtor. The house had become a museum of waiting, every room filled with the ghosts of visits that never came, voicemails that were never left. I had been holding on to the place like it was an anchor, but it had become a cage. and I was ready to leave it, not to escape, to reclaim. I found a small cottage on the edge of a retreat center 3 towns over. It was a quiet place, low stone walls, garden beds, winding paths through wild lavender and sage. The center offered private lodging, no religious affiliation, just solitude, peace, and community for those who needed space to reimagine their lives. I moved in mid-October. No one helped me pack. No one needed to. I gave away what I didn't love. I left the rest. I took my journals, a few keepsakes, and one framed photo of me and Jason from the year he turned 10 before everything had shifted. The cottage smelled like cedar and lemon balm. There was a screened porch, a reading chair by the window, and a tiny kitchen where I could make tea and listen to the birds. The first night I slept there, I dreamed of nothing. Just quiet. Weeks passed. I planted things, lettuce, rosemary, dahlias. My hands in the soil reminded me I was still capable of tending, of growing, even if no one called me mom anymore. I joined a weekly reflection circle, not therapy, just people like me. Women and men whose lives had collapsed in ways that left them changed, but not ruined. I told my story once, just once. And when I was finished, no one tried to fix it. No one tried to explain it away. They just sat with me, in silence, in knowing. And that somehow healed more than anything else ever had. One afternoon, I received an email, not from Jason, from a lawyer. It was short, clinical. A request had been made to resolve a shared deed discrepancy. The other party preferred to settle quietly without further legal action. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I accept. And just like that, the last thread was cut. They would no longer be able to use my name, my accounts, my memory. I was no longer a part of their plan, and I was finally free from it. There were days that grief still visited. I won't pretend it vanished. Grief is a house guest who never fully unpacks, just moves from room to room. But now I could walk beside it without being swallowed. I had learned the difference between being lonely and being alone. One was despair, the other was power, and I had chosen power. The seasons turned with a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. The leaves around the retreat glowed amber and rust, a slow burning away of what no longer served the branches. I watched them fall from my porch rocker with a strange ache in my chest, not sorrow. Exactly something softer, quieter. Something like relief. My days found a rhythm. I woke early, walked the gravel paths around the property, shared coffee with the caretaker Miriam, who smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke. Some afternoons I read in the garden. Other days I just watched the wind move through the trees, wondering how I'd gone so long without being still. I didn't speak to Jason. Not once. And I didn't miss the silence. But then, one day in early November, an unfamiliar car rolled slowly down the drive. I was trimming the rosemary when I heard its tires crackling on gravel, the quiet thud of a door shutting. I stood before I turned. I already knew. Jason. He looked older, thinner than I remembered. His hair had grayed at the temples. His jacket didn't quite fit right, like he'd grabbed it last minute trying to look composed. But his eyes were the same alert, anxious scanning for something he couldn't name. "Hi, Mom," he said. It had been so long since I'd heard his voice, it didn't register at first. Not fully. It felt like a memory trying to stand up inside a living body. "Jason," I said, calm as lake water. He shifted hands in his coat pockets. I wasn't sure if you'd still be here. I am. He glanced at the garden, at the trimmed shrubs, the tidy path. His eyes didn't land on mine for more than a second at a time. It was like he was waiting for permission to breathe. I heard you. Moved out of the house. I did. I drove past once, he said. I saw the for sale sign. I didn't know where you'd gone. I didn't answer. I let the silence do what it needed to. He inhaled slowly. I came to talk about everything. I looked at him, then really looked. He wasn't ready. His posture, his tone, the rehearsed speech I could see building behind his eyes, none of it was real. Not here, I said gently. He blinked. Sorry. I don't want you here. His mouth opened closed. The words hung like mist between us. He looked stunned. Not angry stunned. I'm not angry with you, I said quietly. But this is mine now. This peace. You don't get to walk into it like nothing happened. He nodded slowly, a broken sort of nod. I didn't know what Emily was doing. Not all of it. I tilted my head. You knew enough to let it happen. He swallowed. His throat moved hard. I thought I was protecting you. I thought you needed distance. No, I said. You needed distance. And you needed me to be okay with disappearing. He took a shaky breath. I made mistakes. You made choices. He looked down at his shoes. There was a time I would have softened then, would have stepped forward, touched his arm, offered him absolution before he even earned it. But that woman was gone. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small envelope. There's something I wanted to give you. I didn't take it. He placed it gently on the stone bench beside the rosemary bush. It's not money. It's not a letter. Just photos. Ones I found when I was clearing out a drawer. His voice cracked slightly. You're in all of them. I nodded once. Then maybe that's a start. He stood there another moment, waiting. But I didn't invite him to stay. He finally turned, walked slowly back to the car. As he drove away, I sat down on the bench. The envelope sat beside me light as air. I didn't open it. Not yet. Not because I didn't care, but because healing doesn't happen on someone else's timeline. That evening, I lit a single candle in the kitchen. I made soup from scratch. I curled up in my chair with a blanket over my lap and a book resting against my knees. The wind howled softly against the eaves, but inside, everything was still. He had come. That mattered. But he had left. And that mattered more. Because the apology was not the point. The peace was mine. A week passed before I opened the envelope. I don't know why I waited. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that I didn't need what was inside. That my healing didn't depend on scraps of remorse or nostalgia. Maybe I just wanted to see if I could sit with the not knowing and still be whole. But on the 7th night, as the sun dipped below the ridge and the garden shadows stretched long across the porch, I sat at the kitchen table and slowly peeled the flap open. It wasn't much. A dozen photographs, most of them bent at the corners, printed on the glossy paper drugstores used before everything went digital. There was one of me and Jason at his 8th grade graduation. I had my arm around his shoulders and he was grinning, 2 front teeth slightly crooked before the braces came. Another from the beach trip we took after his college acceptance. I was in a sun hat holding a melting cone of vanilla ice cream, laughing at something he'd said. He must have taken that one without me knowing. Then near the bottom, a photo I'd completely forgotten about. Christmas morning. Jason had just unwrapped a leather-bound stethoscope case. his eyes wide, hands over his mouth, and I was behind him in my old plaid robe, smiling like the sun was rising inside my chest. I held that one the longest. It wasn't the photos that undid me. It was the way they were bundled, not in any neat arrangement, not chronologically, not carefully ordered, just gathered. Like someone had rifled through old drawers and for the first time thought, she mattered. These are hers too. I pressed the pictures back into the envelope and placed it in my bedside drawer, not as a keepsake, as a witness. Something had cracked open in Jason. Whether it would hold, I didn't know. Whether he'd grow into the man I once believed he was capable of becoming, I couldn't say. But I knew one thing now, and I knew it without doubt. I would no longer wait to be loved the way I deserved. I wouldn't show up in other people's stories hoping for a role. I wouldn't water down my presence to stay digestible. I would not offer myself up for erasure. The next morning, I joined Miriam and 2 other women at the long wooden table in the retreat's greenhouse. We were potting seedlings, swapping recipes, laughing about how none of us could keep basil alive through winter. One of them, Grace, a tall woman with silver hair and clay permanently under her fingernails, looked at me and said, "You've been lighter lately." "Different." I smiled. I think I finally stopped asking questions I already knew the answers to. She nodded. "That's how it starts." Later that afternoon, I received a letter. A real one. Handwritten. No return address again, but the penmanship was unmistakable. Emily. I sat with the envelope in my lap for a long time. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper, but I didn't open it. I had no curiosity about her words, no hunger for apology. I knew any version of remorse she offered would be for herself, not me. A performance dressed as humility. I lit a match and dropped the letter into the fireplace, not with anger, with relief. Some voices didn't deserve to live in my house anymore. I made dinner for myself that night. Lemon roasted chicken garlic potatoes, green beans with a little too much butter. I sat at the small table by the window, watching the soft gold of early evening settle over the field. I poured a glass of wine. I lit a single candle, and I raised the glass not in a toast, but in a marking, the end of something, the beginning of something else. It wasn't triumph. It was truth, and I had earned every inch of it. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the edge of the ocean. The waves rolled in quietly, brushing over my bare feet. In the dream, Jason was beside me, but younger, maybe 12 or 13, and we weren't speaking. Just standing there, the water gently folding and unfolding between us. When I turned to him, he was already fading. But I didn't feel panic. I let him go. And when I woke up, the quiet in my chest was not emptiness. It was space. The first real snow came in December, soft as breath, covering the cottage roof in a thin, glistening veil. I watched it from the porch, wrapped in my thick wool shawl, a cup of mint tea cupped between my hands. The world had gone still, not dead, but sleeping. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me again. Not sadness, not grief, permission. I didn't decorate for Christmas that year. I didn't send out cards or bake my usual tins of cookies or hang the wreath Jason made in 4th grade that had once hung on my front door for 22 years straight. I didn't do any of it. And the strange thing, I didn't miss it. There was a freedom in that, in not performing tradition for the sake of others, in no longer pretending that joy came wrapped in rituals that had long since stopped, including me. I went for walks instead, long ones down the forest trail that curved behind the meditation hall. I found myself stopping by the creek and just listening water over stone wind through bare branches, the creak of trees stretching into the cold. No one asked where I was. No one expected me to show up with pies or presents. There were no texts about what time to arrive. No updates from Jason. There was only me. And the more space I gave that silence, the more I began to realize how much I had been holding together for so long. Not for my own sake, but for everyone else's. I thought of all the years I'd hosted Christmas, all the grocery runs, the careful seating arrangements, the handmade stockings, the little gifts I gave to Emily spa kits, teas, those silly monogrammed towels she never used, all those gestures met with silence or tight smiles or polite indifference. And still I had tried, because I believed that if I just loved enough, gave enough, bent enough, I would be invited in. But I wasn't invited. I was tolerated until I wasn't even that. One evening, Miriam knocked on my door, holding a bottle of red wine and a deck of old tarot cards. "Feel like a little future-telling?" she asked with a grin. I laughed and let her in. We sat on the floor, wine glasses resting on coasters made from driftwood. She shuffled the deck and laid out 3 cards, the past, the present, and the future. She turned them slowly with the quiet ceremony of someone who didn't believe in magic, but knew that symbols could speak to places deeper than logic. The first card, the 10 of Swords. "A betrayal," she said softly, tapping the image, a figure laid face down, 10 blades in their back. Pain that came not from strangers, but from those you trusted. I nodded. No resistance. The second card, the Hermit. "Solitude," she said. "Not loneliness, insight. The path inward." I felt a warmth behind my eyes. Not tears, just recognition. The final card, the Empress. Miriam smiled. Creation, restoration, the return of your own power. I looked at the figure in the card, seated serene, surrounded by wheat and stars and life. She wasn't looking outward. She wasn't chasing anything. She simply was. We didn't speak after that. Just sipped our wine. Let the candle burn low. Let the truth hang unspoken in the room. I had been broken open. And somehow in the cracks, something had started to bloom. A few days later, a small package arrived. No note. Just a slim velvet box. Inside, my original wedding ring. Not the one from Jason's father that had been sold off years ago after the divorce. No. This one was a simple band I had bought for myself on the day I paid off my mortgage. I'd worn it on my right hand for almost a decade, a symbol of something I built alone, something no one could take from me. It had gone missing during one of Jason's visits the year before. I had torn the house apart looking for it, and eventually assumed it had been lost at the laundromat or slipped down a drain. Now here it was, tucked into black velvet, returned in silence. I didn't need to ask who sent it, and I didn't write back, not because I hadn't forgiven, but because forgiveness for me had become private, quiet, no longer a performance for people who didn't earn it. I took the ring out of the box and slipped it onto my finger. It still fit. New Year's Eve came like a whisper. No fireworks, no champagne. Just a pale winter moon hanging low over the retreat grounds and the crunch of frost under my boots as I walked the gravel path alone. The others were gathered near the bonfire pit, wrapped in blankets, passing mugs of cider and singing old folk songs I didn't recognize. They'd invited me warmly without pressure, but I chose to walk instead. There was something sacred about moving into the new year on my own 2 feet. No timeline, no audience, just me. Just the sound of my breath and the cold brushing against my cheeks like a soft warning. You're not done yet, but you're healing. I stopped near the meditation bell, a tall bronze sculpture that stood silent unless struck, and looked up at the stars. The kind of stars you only see when you're far from the noise of cities, when the world gets quiet enough to show you what's always been there. And I whispered a promise, not for anyone else, just for me. Never again will I make myself small in the name of someone else's comfort. Never again will I confuse silence for peace. Never again will I give the best of me to those who only take. It wasn't a resolution. It was a return. That night I wrote Jason's name on a slip of paper. Just his name. No message. No anger. No questions. I folded it carefully, walked to the fire pit after everyone had gone to bed, and dropped it into the glowing coals. It curled and blackened in silence. A release. A ritual. A truth no longer mine to carry. The next morning the world was silver. Frost hung from every branch like lace. The garden was quiet under its winter blanket. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood at the window watching the slow exhale of steam rise into the cold morning light. That's when I noticed a single bird, small and gray, perched on the bare cherry tree outside my window. It didn't sing. It just sat there. Still. Unbothered. Present. I stood with it for a long time. It was a week later when Miriam stopped by with a flyer in her hand. "They're opening a community workshop," she said. "Art writing, garden planning. Thought you might want to teach something." I laughed. "Teach?" She tilted her head. "You know more about rebuilding than anyone I've ever met." I didn't say yes. Not then. But that night I sat at my desk and pulled out one of the old journals I hadn't touched since before the wedding. Most of it was pain, fear, questions without answers. But toward the back there were pages I'd forgotten, dreams I once wrote down, ideas for a memoir, notes on grief and motherhood, and how to survive being invisible in a world that only values the loud. I read them all, and something inside me stirred. Not ambition, not revenge, but voice. Mine. I began writing again, not about Jason, not about Emily, not even about the wedding, but about becoming what it means to belong to yourself after a lifetime of trying to belong to others. I wrote late into the night. The words didn't come easily. They weren't pretty. But they were true, and that was enough. Weeks passed. Winter softened, and one morning, while clipping dead leaves from the rose bush near the cottage gate, I found the first sign of spring, a single bud, pink and stubborn, pushing up through frost-bitten soil. I crouched down beside it and brushed the dirt gently from its stem. It was still growing. So was I. The first class I taught was small, just 5 women, most of them older, all of them with stories written into the fine lines around their mouths and the quiet ache in their eyes. We sat in a circle in the old greenhouse sunlight slanting through the glass roof dust rising in the air like memory made visible. We didn't start with introductions. We started with silence. Then I asked them a question. When did you first feel invisible? No one answered at first. Then Grace, the one who always wore silver bangles and smelled faintly of clove, said, "When my youngest left for college and didn't look back." Another woman whispered, "When my husband started finishing my sentences, but not the way I would have said them. A third said, when my son's wife smiled at me like I was a piece of old furniture she hadn't asked for. And I nodded, because I knew, because I had lived it. We wrote in quiet for half an hour. Pages filled, some fast and some slow. There were tears, but no apologies for them. No one tried to fix anyone else's pain. That's what made it sacred. After class, I stayed behind to sweep the floor and collect the extra pencils, and I realized something so small, it almost felt like nothing I didn't miss Jason that day. Not once. Not his voice. Not his silence. Not even the boy he used to be. He had become someone I didn't recognize, and I had become someone who didn't need to. That night I wrote him a letter. Not to send, just to finish something. Jason, you were the great project of my life. I gave you everything, and when it was time for you to become your own man, I thought I had done well, but somewhere along the way you learned to step over the people who helped you rise. You learned to disappear the parts of the story that weren't flattering. I was one of them. I don't hate you. I don't wish you harm, but I see you clearly now, and I release you from the story I kept writing in my head, the one where you come back, the one where you explain, the one where we fix it. There will be no fixing, only truth, and I am finally free from waiting. I folded the letter and burned it in the fireplace. The flames were quiet, no drama, no spark. Just paper curling into nothing. In the spring, I planted tomatoes. I kneaded the soil with bare hands, thumbed tiny seeds into the earth, marked the rows with old popsicle sticks, the same way my grandmother had shown me when I was 9. There was a rhythm to it, water, sun, patience. Nothing came quickly. Nothing worth keeping ever does. One morning I stepped outside to find 2 women kneeling beside the lavender patch, whispering and laughing, shovels in their hands. They looked up when they saw me. Sorry, one said. We didn't mean to. I smiled. Stay as long as you like. They did. We drank tea on the porch. We talked about grief and body aches and what it feels like to start over at 60. One of them, Angela, reached over and touched my hand. I wish I had your peace, she said, and I looked at her, really looked and said, it didn't come from healing, it came from finally stopping the bleed. She didn't ask what I meant. She just nodded. A week later, I received one final email from Jason. No subject line, no long explanation, just 2 sentences. I understand now. I'm sorry it took this long. I read it twice, then I archived it, not out of cruelty, out of peace, because sometimes the apology doesn't arrive until after the version of you that needed it is already gone. The tomatoes came in early that year, fat, red, sun-warmed, and sweet. I picked them barefoot just after dawn, apron tied loosely around my waist hair, still damp from the shower. The dew clung to the hem of my linen pants, and the dirt was cool between my toes. There was a stillness to the morning that felt earned, like the quiet was finally for me, and not something I had to shrink into. I brought the harvest inside and lined the tomatoes on the windowsill, letting them catch the light. I stood there for a while watching the steam rise from my coffee, the tiny motion of the leaves just outside the glass. My reflection caught in the pain older, yes, but whole, rooted. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't need to. There was no summit I had climbed, no grand reward waiting on the other side of the pain. But I had made space for myself, real sacred space, and filled it with nothing but the sound of my own voice, finally unburdened by the need to be heard. That morning I sat in the chair by the porch and wrote my name in a blank notebook. Just my name. Eleanor Thompson. Not mom, not mother of the groom, not family obligation or background figure. Just me. And it was enough. Later that week, I submitted a short piece to a local journal, a small essay about loss and soil, about how grief moves like water under the skin. They published it. Someone left a comment online. I feel like this woman wrote down what I didn't know I'd been carrying. I didn't respond, but I closed my laptop and smiled, because I knew the weight of invisible things, and I had learned how to set them down. The wedding had been a closing, but it had also been a beginning. It had cut me loose from a story I no longer belonged to, and for the first time I had written my own. A story not about what was taken, but what I reclaimed, not through revenge, through silence, stillness, sovereignty. I still think of Jason sometimes, not with bitterness, with distance. He lives in a house I helped pay for, wears a life stitched together with pieces of my past. I wonder if he ever sees my hands when he picks up a pen, if he hears my voice when the house is quiet. I don't know, and I don't need to, because here in this small cottage with its creaking floorboards and lavender-lined garden, I have finally returned to myself, fully, quietly, completely. Eleanor Thompson, once defined by everyone but herself, finally exists on her day, and that you even now understand is the greatest revenge of all. Thanks for listening. If you've ever felt the same betrayed, discarded, or invisible, leave a comment. Someone will hear you. Don't forget to subscribe. Your voice matters.